So you have been a major cheerleader for this movie and the novel on which it's based for many years, and I'd like to know where that personal connection to this material started for you.
Yeah, it goes way back. I mean, it goes to the origins of why I do what I do, why I'm a writer. I know the movie came out in '73. I didn't see it then. But in September of 1974, I went to college, my freshman year of college at the University of Florida. So I can't pinpoint it, but sometime during that year, September 74 to May of 75, I was a pretty religious goer to the Monday night dollar movie at the Student Union, and I would go by myself all the time because, like most freshman college kids, I was having trouble adjusting. I was on my own and so forth. And so I saw it at one of those Monday night movies. And back then, the University of Florida had a fledgling film school. And so on Monday nights, they would show a film, and then a film professor or a student or assistant professor would critique it afterwards and lead a discussion about it. So I stayed for this discussion, and a lot of the discussion centered on how it differed so much from the book, which was considered a classic private eye novel, and why would you change it and all that kind of stuff. And that's a debate that follows this movie for 45 years. But I was interested in it. So, the next day or the day after, I went to a bookstore and bought the book, The Long Goodbye, and read the book. And I loved the book. I can't say I loved one better than the other. I loved them both for different reasons. But the book led me to the rest of the Raymond Chandler books, and there's not a lot. There's like 5 others. And I read through all those. I stopped going to school, my classes, and I read these books like nonstop. I binged them, even though that wasn't a word back then. And then I binged them again, and when I kind of came out of this deep Raymond Chandler tunnel, I said to myself, I want to do this. And at that time, I was an engineering major, and then I switched to journalism and creative writing. And so I can really kind of trace the path I've been on for as long as this movie's been around to that movie. Sorry for the long answer.
Wow. No, that's amazing. Yeah. I mean, movies and literature, they really can change lives, and you are the shining example of that.
Yeah, I mean, I had an experience in a couple years before where I was kind of a semi-witness to a crime. It was someone got shot during what would later be termed a carjacking. And I didn't see that part. I saw a guy running, and I saw him hide a gun. And I, became a little sleuth myself. And I was in a car, and he was running. And this is where I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I followed him from a distance till I saw him go into a bar. And then I doubled back, and there was police cars all over the place. I knew something had happened, so I flagged down cops, took him to the gun, took him to the bar. The guy wasn't in the bar anymore, but I ended up spending a night in a police station with detectives, questioning me, and they were bringing in suspects, and I was looking at lineups, and I was there for hours. I was basically there till dawn. What I saw happened around midnight while I was driving home from a dishwasher job. I was 16. And so that evening had made me very interested in detectives because, I felt disappointed because I said the guy went in there and they took out a lot of people that matched his description in this bar. But they didn't have the guy, and the detective thought I was afraid to ID him, and that wasn't the case. And so it kind of finished on a bad note where they were disappointed in me and I couldn't convince them they didn't have the right guy. And that, just something about that experience suddenly made me interested in crime and cops and so forth and detectives. And I was reading and watching movies in this genre, if you will. And so I was kind of primed. I was set up for when I saw this movie. And of course, I'd never been to Los Angeles, but something about the view of Los Angeles and the tone of that film, it all kind of came together for me, led me to the books, then led me to what I've been doing ever since.
I'm like you, I imagine, in that I have a very romanticized a view of LA, even the seedy aspects of the city. I mean, there's something so alluring about Los Angeles for me. And I'm sure, I mean, that's a big part of what I love about the work that you do, the LA-centric nature of it. What makes LA so well tailored towards kind of the detective noir genre?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's many things, so it's hard to put your finger on everything. But I never set foot in L.A. till I was 30 years old, and I came for a job interview at the L.A. Times. And I got the job, and I moved out here, so I was kind of a latecomer to the city. But on the orientation of my job was to cover crime and police. My editor said to me, L.A. is a shady. He said L.A. is a sunny place for shady people, and that's what your job is going to be covering. And that description, I've never been able to top that description. Just kind of handed to me offhanded by a newspaper editor. And it just is a kind of place that has all kinds of beauty. You can keep your eyes wide open at the stunning things you see here. You got oceans, you got mountains, you got deserts. But it's still a place that in many areas you got to kind of casually at least look over your shoulder. It has this kind of edge to it, and I think that comes from being a place that most people have come from somewhere else to try to fix their lives or reach their dreams, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm an example of that. I grew up in South Florida. I had a great job at a newspaper, but I was at night trying to write novels and it wasn't working, and so I decided to shake my life up at age 30 and I moved to Los Angeles. So I was just like all these people who come there chasing the brass ring, and not a lot, it's a small percentage of people that actually reach that ring. And so you really have a sense of the haves and the have-nots in this town. And, I think that leads to the creative part of it's good grist for the mill. It's where some good drama can take place. And so I think that might be one of many reasons why this place has that allure.
Do you still, when you travel around, I mean, LA is so spread out and there's so many different distinctive communities there, but do you still see evidence of Chandler's LA when you look around?
Yeah. It's what's marvelous about his work is that it does, for the most part, stand the test of time. I mean, there's some stuff and some attitudes in his books, especially towards women and minorities, that doesn't obviously hold up. But his descriptions of the place and the thing that we're trying to talk about, that thing, that almost indescribable thing that makes it a place of great opportunity and at the same time personal danger. And I don't mean like someone hitting you in the back of the head. I mean, you can become self-corrupt here, I think. And he captures that. And the example I always say is he had wrote a book called The Little Sister, and there's a chapter 11 in it. It has nothing to do with plot. It's about the protagonist, Marlowe, the same guy in The Long Goodbye, being frustrated with a case and taking a drive around the city. And I read it all the time. I read it before I write my own books. It's kind of like a inspirational message, because that chapter is kind of a roundabout. The track he takes is actually still available. It's like the roads. In fact, one's become a freeway, but in the book it's just a road. But you can drive that, and his descriptions hold up because he goes beyond the facade of stores and clubs and things like that. He gets to what's going on behind them, and tapping into that hidden darkness and so forth. And it's just a beautiful chapter that, when it's 70-some years later and it still matters and it still is on point, that's art. So that's why it's kind of like the thing that I aspire to and read before I start writing. Many places in the movie are are still around. I mean, I rented that apartment. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but Marlowe's apartment in the movie, I had that for about 5 years. It was like a writing office for me.
Did it still have the elevator?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
wow.
the apartment where the yoga sisters operate, that's all different. That was renovated, and they don't have that porch there anymore. So that's different. But the Marlowe's apartment was almost the same, and it's kind of been handed over to a procession of writers who were inspired the same way as me. It's almost like Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, and when everyone is heading towards that mountain and they don't know why. Different writers have rented that place over the years. Some of them have turned out to be pretty big successes. I'm trying to remember some of them. I remember when I was leaving it, Shane Black, who's a director and writer here in town,
wow.
He came to look at it. I don't know if he ever rented it, but he was a friend of a friend, and they came by to look at it because he was had the same sense about that movie. And if you look at his movies like The Good Guys and stuff like that, they're very much influenced by Altman's Long Goodbye.
Sure, like Kiss Kiss Bang Bang is a great example of it. But you wrote The Lincoln Lawyer there, didn't you?
I wrote parts of several books there. I wrote, like Echo Park, as a Harry Bosch book I wrote, actually opens it's called the High Tower, in the garage that I was given, and then I moved the manager's office to the apartment I was in, the Marlowe apartment. So yeah, I've used it in some books that were written while there, and a large part of the Lincoln Lawyer was written there. The downside of it was, it's funny, when you see movies and it looks like the old cars are so big, but I guess they weren't, because you got one garage that was so small, so thin, that, I forget what kind of car I had, but I could barely open the doors to get out, so it was really just a storage place, and then there was almost no parking around, so it was a real difficult. I had it before the age of Uber. If they had Uber back then, I probably wouldn't have even had a car in LA. But that was a problem, that there was, literally zero parking unless you rode a motorcycle. You could fit in the garage. And then the apartment itself had a window shaker in the bedroom. It was a one-bedroom apartment, but the rest of the place was not air-conditioned because it had that curving wall windows that all opened, and they were fantastic. 9 months of the year, but 3 months of the year the place was so hot it was almost unlivable. So I suffered through it because of the romantic connection to it, and I think it did inspire me, and I loved the elevator you had to take up to get to it. But ultimately, after I think I had it 4 years, I got some sweeter digs for writing.
Right. Yeah, certainly that screenwriting, in many respects, is a different animal than novel writing. So when you read the book from The Long Goodbye, what kind of lessons did you take from how Lee Brackett adapted that work?
I don't think I was mature enough to be making those kind of comparisons. I have over time, and I've read Lee Brackett's screenplay and so forth. But it's you become accustomed to what you start with, is the way I believe. So there's a lot of screenwriters who come out of college and they write screenplays, and then when they want to write a novel, they have a hard time doing that transition, and vice versa. I always had a hard time since I started with novels. When I got jobs or just on my own wanted to write screenplays, you kind of get used to what you know how to do. And the big difference to me is, and I think they did a great job in the movie, but the big difference is the interior thought. When I write these Harry Bosch novels, you're seeing the world through his eyes. You know what he's thinking and so forth. And in screenplays, you can't do that. So that's the challenge I've had working for the last 4 or 5 years on a Bosch TV show, is taking this character that I know how he thinks and I know what he thinks, and then writing scripts where you can't use that. It's only what he says and what he does. And I think one of the intoxicatingly addictive things about Philip Marlowe is the way he views the world and what he thinks. And, and most of that is directed towards the city that is so beautiful and has everything going for it, but it can't get it right. That is imbued in all the novels, and it's not something anyone could ever say. That detective could never say, "I wish this city could get it right." You'd lose everybody, and so it's very hard to make that kind of transition of a major character's outlook on the world. And I just certain little things, the sardonic humor, even down to like scratching his matches on the wall by his bed, says something about the way this guy looks at the world. And it just, it came together. I thought it was a very accurate portrayal of an update, obviously 20 or 30 years later, of that character.
Yeah, and what's most, first of all, I'm a huge Altman fanatic, and I do love the way that he worked in very established genres that had a very long-standing kind of structure and build to them, and he worked to see how much he could stretch within that framework. And at the same time, I know that when this movie came out, a lot of critics said, he doesn't respect the traditions of Marlowe and this whole genre. I did not find that he belittled it. I found that he had great affection for that genre, and in terms of the theme of the movie, that comes out because Marlowe works by a moral code. And what makes the movie so interesting is he's placed in a world in 1970s Los Angeles where that morality is in decay, and he can't really find his footing in that. Do you find that appealing as well about it?
Yeah, the man out of time thing is very intriguing. And also, I was like 18 going on 19 when I saw this. It just hit me at the right time, like his as you say, his code, his trying to understand people that he finds hard to understand. All that stuff just seemed to be pretty powerful to me. I think I was at the right age, to really latch onto it.
Yeah.
And and again, like I studied the film, I read about it. I actually did if your listeners go to YouTube, I did this hour-long interview with Elliott Gould once that was pretty interesting, only about the movie, not about his career, just this one movie. And so it's something I it's like a hobby. And so it's hard for me to know what I knew when I knew it. But, in analyzing it, you definitely see that idea of the man out of time, from his car, the way he always puts on his tie, that formal nature of that, things that just didn't work, and the things that now I'm forgetting his name, the guy who kills him. The guy he kills. What's his name again? Jim Bouton. It's weird that they're even friends in the film because he seems to belittle Marlowe's steadfast code and adherence to times that appear to have gone past, at least in Los Angeles.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things, doesn't the book go into more detail about how they befriended one another? Is that one of the things that they streamlined for the movie?
Yeah, they had like a whole, World War II connection and met often in bars, and so a couple of recipes for how to make gimlets and all these type of things. So it was more of a... that's probably one thing that was shortchanged as things get in film, is more of a deeper relationship and more of a deeper betrayal, I think, in the book.
Yeah. Well, but in the movie, I mean, it does kind of make itself obvious that this is a man who doesn't really keep company with many friends. I mean, he's very solitary. His friends are his cat, and he has this. One of the choice of the movie is, especially the beginning, this ongoing monologue of him talking to himself. I mean, and it does kind of bring up the fact that he lives a very solitary existence in terms of close connections with people.
Yeah, I mean, all that is true, and I think that, I love the movie. I always say that and Chinatown are my two favorite movies, and I couldn't pick one over the other. But I think that is, now that I guess you could call me a seasoned storyteller. If I turned in a story like the movie story, I would probably think this myself, but I know the editor would say his loyalty to this guy is not supported by what we know about him, because he's a loner. Like, how could this guy get so close to him that he wouldn't be suspicious, that he would drive him to Mexico without a question? All those things don't add up in the movie. In the book, they do, because you got more pages, you got more words, and so forth, and the history of their relationship is there, and it's kind of like a foxhole like mentality. If you've been to a war with someone, and I don't mean side by side, but if you've had those experiences, I think it connects you in a way, and that's missing from the movie. So
yeah.
That to me, and that all takes place in, the first 15 minutes when he agrees to take this guy, and then he doesn't say anything to the cops. It's all wonderful stuff, especially when he is arrested and so forth. But it does have that question, like, we've already seen that your best friend is your cat, and they basically, in the construction of the screenplay, they replace the history of their Terry Lennox. I keep forgetting his name. The Marlowe Lennox friendship. They replace it with the cat, and so I think it does leave that hole. And I'm not telling you anything that I've just thought of myself or anything, because I've had debates. I'm well known within the world that I live, the genre of crime writing, as being a defender of this film, and there's many experts out there who think that they've actually said this film is an abomination to me. So I've had these kind of debates, and that's one of their big arguments, that there's a big hole there, and why he would go to the lengths he did for the Terry Lennox in the movie.
Well, I know another point that stuck in a lot of people's craw when this came out was the casting with Elliott Gould, who, it's obvious that he stands in sharp contrast against somebody like a Humphrey Bogart or a Robert Mitchum or what have you. But what elements of that character do you think Elliott Gould brought out that was unique to him? I don't know. The one thing I always say about that is that I had never read any of the books or seen the Bogart movie. This was my first immersion into Raymond Chandler's world, and so from the start, I thought this guy was perfect. This guy was L.A. And I've seen all those others, but once you kind of like subscribe to the Robert Altman Long Goodbye, you can't really see one else, anybody else. So it's like, it's sacrilege to say this, but I just think he was way better at it than Gould was way better at it than Humphrey Bogart. And I've said that before, and I get shouted down, like, how could you say that? But I think it has something to do with who brought you to the party or whatever. And I came in with Elliott Gould, so I always thought he was great. And it comes back to some of the things we've already talked about. There, and this is out of the book, so there's a very sardonic, cynical side, kind of a hopeful cynicism, if you will. I know that's a contradiction, but that's what I've always gotten in Marlowe, and I think Elliott Gould is just fantastic at it. And when I would watch years later, Bogart, I think he's kind of stiff at it. He's Humphrey Bogart at it. So I don't know. Talking about stuff that will probably get people
yelling at your podcast and so forth, but that's the way I felt. And I just think, as you said, this was an updating. This was L.A. early 70s where things formalities and codes of conduct and so forth were beginning to decay and change. And so it is appropriate to have a Marlowe who kind of looks askance at all this stuff, who doesn't trust the police, who trusts his own instincts. And I thought Gould was really great at that.
Well, and you've talked about, I've heard you talk about this before, kind of the contrast between hope and cynicism that you feel running through this material. And it's certainly true of the movie, but also true of a lot of movies from this 70s period of New Hollywood. How do you see the film dealing with themes that were kind of coming up in the 70s, specific to that culture?
I don't want to act professorial about it. I just know that I love the film. I know it inspired me, so I don't want to act like I'm such a smart guy. But I think the country was after World War II. It was so unified and I don't know what the right word is, proud and so forth. And then we moved forward and that started to be corrupted probably by Vietnam War and assassinations and things like that. So I'm not trying to act like this great historian of things, but the country was changing, and you had Nixon who turned out to be corrupt and so forth. And so I think it created this suspicion of our institutions and the standards that for about 30 years we had, held so tightly to. And so a lot of these films were picking up on that, and it so happened that a lot of them were crime films. And I, in my high school years and then after, my father loved movies and my mother loved movies, but she didn't like violent movies, and so she wouldn't go to any kind of cop movie. So I was taken to many cop movies, starting with Bullitt in 1968 or so. My dad and I regularly went to cop movies, and I saw lots of these. And I shouldn't call them just cop, I should say crime movies, because a lot of them were private eye stuff. And I think these things were tapping into this sense that things were changing and that we have to be suspicious of our police and our institutions and our politicians and all that kind of stuff. And so that to me is like just a wonderful age of crime movies, like 68 to 76 or something. And that's also why, I got away from home and went to college. I was no longer going to movies with my father, so I was going to them by myself, and I stumbled across this movie that I would go on Monday nights no matter what it was. I didn't even go knowing what this was, and then I saw it, and it was opened my eyes to something in a new way.
Well, you say that you've had debates over the years with colleagues and friends about this movie, and I'm sure the ending is a point of contention for a lot of critics of it. How do you defend the ending? How does it feel right for you?
It seemed like the natural progression of the story. It seemed a little harsh, but it seemed like at the point at the end of this film, there was not going to be any kind of justice for anybody unless Marlowe took it into his own hands. And I don't know. Sitting there watching it as an 18-year-old, I agreed with it. I liked it. Then probably within 2 weeks, I read the book, and it's quite a different ending. And then I had that puzzle in my own head, like which is better. Like, well, when this book came out, that might have been appropriate because that was back in that post-World War II thing where everything was, father knows best type of world, and the 70s were not the same. I remember that when I saw this movie, I was waiting to figure out if I was going to get drafted. I was 18. It was the last draft for Vietnam, and so there's a lot of not knowing what lies ahead for me and for the country and for everybody who was on my floor. in the college dorms. We were all 18. It was the last draft was coming up and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. Considering the situation I was in and what happened in this film, I didn't object to it. That is the biggest debate that I've encountered. Like, you don't take an author's book and, change it that dramatically at the end. Why do you buy the book if that's what you're going to do? Just tell your own story where the hero kills the bad guy. And I get all that. And, and I was always, a supporter of the film. And then many years later, I had a movie made of one of my books called Bloodwork. And it was so dramatically changed at the end in many of the same ways. The bad guy was changed. They changed the bad guy, and then I kind of had that same experience of having a book really go through changes on its way to becoming a film. And it didn't change my opinion. I wish I could say, it might be dramatic to say, and then I understood what everyone said about The Long Goodbye. It shouldn't have been changed. I don't feel that way. I still felt that the choices made in the 1973 Long Goodbye were 1973 choices, and they were the right ones.
Yeah. I don't want to get too highfalutin about it, but, I mean, this does speak to character, which is one of your specialties. I mean, you've crafted such great, diverse characters over your career. And when I think of that last scene of The Long Goodbye and the brief conversation they have when he says to Marlowe, "You're a loser," and Marlowe says, "Yeah, I even lost my cat," and then he shoots his friend. At that moment, do you think that Marlowe loses something of himself? I mean, is that what the movie's saying to you?
I don't want to get too highfalutin either. I don't know. I don't know what he's saying. I keep coming at it from the standpoint of what my age was when I saw it for the first time and what I thought. To me, I think I was thinking that he had learned a lesson, that just stick with the cat and then don't reach out to people because they're going to betray you. So to me, it was just on a basic level of betrayal. And then you add the component that if Marlowe doesn't do something about this, corruption wins. Bad guys win. They have this wonderful pool and this hideaway in Mexico and the money. And there's probably a little bit of a component that they're laughing at this guy who they got to do their bidding. They call a loser. So all that stuff added up to, in my mind, to firing the gun.
The supporting characters in the movie, the detective works, the detective genre, and L.A. in general, as you spoke to earlier, there's such a cavalcade of just eccentric, interesting people, and they're represented in this movie. The one that I like the most is the gatekeeper that does the impressions of the old movie stars. And I think he's, like a lot of the movie, he is paying homage to those classic Hollywood movies. I mean, it's still there in the DNA of the movie through characters like that.
No, that guy's great. It's funny. I have a daughter who's in film school, and so it's been fun to. I think she had to watch Nashville. In a class, and so she knows I love movies, so she reports to me on the stuff she's watching and so forth, and she really liked Nashville. So then we had like an Altman film festival, and she was home on break, and I can still remember when we were watching Long Goodbye. She thought as this guy's rolling up to the gate that it would be a good time to take a break and run into the kitchen to get something, and I said, no, don't leave. This is really good. This guy's great. And it is one of the parts I'm most fond with. But it's also sad how he gets set up. That guy, he did that role so well, and when the guy followed him, and I think it's Arkin, and he does imitation, and the guy doesn't know what he's doing. He just has this little moment of disappointment, like an actor's moment of disappointment that you don't understand my greatness. And that it's such a very L.A. moment. Yes, it's a kickback or an homage to some of the noir films and so forth, but to me it was just representative of L.A., that everyone has one job, but there's something else. They have that dream going for them. This guy's obviously wants to be an entertainer of some sort. And so even when his audience of one is going like, what are you doing? It just saddens him, and the look on his face is just so perfect. It's one of the highlights of the film for me. The other one is the piano player and the connection to the soundtrack of using the Mercer song over and over in different ways. I thought that was really genius.
I think so too. There's an element of that with the music that's very playful, and at the same time, it's. I was thinking about this the other day, that if you're at Marlowe is kind of this throwback character that's his challenge is to try to adapt to these different times, and here you have this music that's essentially the same theme throughout, that's having to adapt to different circumstances as well. And I don't know if that was the thinking, but I like that idea of using the same theme throughout with different kind of takes on it.
I don't know if it is either, but it's an astute observation, I think.
What is the pivotal moment in the movie for you? I mean, coming from the point of view of a storyteller, what's kind of the inciting incident or the most important scene for you in the movie?
The component of the writer in this obviously has become more important to me over the years as I become a writer and a novelist, and I know some of the stresses and so forth that Roger Wade was under, and in terms of trying to create. And so I guess over the years, I'll just say it that way, his death is always really striking to me. And Marlowe in a brief way. It's funny. Here's this guy who apparently only has a cat as a best friend, but is so loyal to this one guy. He drives him to Mexico even though his face is bleeding and all that stuff. And then in a matter of a couple of visits, he connects with this other guy, and he develops a loyalty that makes him carry the case and keep looking for him. And so I think losing him like that, and then the dog running with a cane in its mouth and so forth, it just has always affected me. I shouldn't say always affected me. It affects me now when I watch it. I can't remember if that was so striking to me when I saw it the first time. And what's interesting is that, I saw this, when I was 18 or 19, and then there was a really long time before I ever saw it again, because we had to develop having, what were they? I don't know, when we first could watch movies, rent movies and take them home, the Blockbuster era and all that stuff. So
yeah,
I when I first moved to LA, I moved to LA in '86, and the first week I was here, shockingly, I saw a place that had a double billing of Long Goodbye in Chinatown. So I went because these are both movies I loved, but I had not seen in more than 10 years. And so that reacquainted me with both those films. And then soon after, you could get these things on, what were they called? VHS. God, I can't even think of it. So old. And then you could rent them.
But that's so true, because people do not appreciate. I mean, younger people don't appreciate that today. But there was a time when by a lot of colleges throughout the country there were repertory houses, and that's the one opportunity you had to see a movie for a long time. Now you could just pull up any scene you want on YouTube or anywhere else on the internet. It's a luxury that wasn't afforded to us back in the day.
Yeah.
I want to ask about your series real quick, because this is something that, with the Bosch series, both the books and the Amazon show, really interests me about writers and their connection to the film versions of their work. I know you're really closely involved in the creation of the series. What is the dynamic like when you're working with different actors? Because you've had probably, I would imagine, something like a dozen or so directors maybe throughout the history of the series so far. Is it a calibration that you have to go through with each one, or how does that work?
Well, TV is a lot different from film, and film, the director is the creative boss, and in TV, the director is extremely important, but they're not the creative boss because they come in and out. I mean, some shows, have the same directors for every episode or every other episode. I think they're called producing directors, and they're more vitally involved in the creative side of what we're shooting. But on TV, it's a writer's medium, and so we work with all these directors, but they do the bidding of the writing room essentially. And so the procedure or the protocol is that whoever wrote a script is on set for every shot of their script being made. And, they work with the director, but the director, if there's an argument or a dispute, the writer wins. Because the writer's there. We've had several writers have been on the show for 4 years. They know the long-term, story we're trying to tell, and the director's coming in to shoot 50 minutes of it. And our season is 500 minutes, so it just wouldn't work for someone to come in as an auteur and change things and so forth.
Right.
It just doesn't happen, and it's not an argument, or there's no friction about it. That's TV.
Right.
But some directors really get a sense of the tone and have helped us set the tone. And so when we see that, we want them to come back. So we've had some directors that do like 2 a season.
I know Ernest Dickerson has done a lot of, hasn't he? He's
probably done more than anyone. I think he's done 2 every season, and that and also it's hard to get. Directors in TV have 8 days. They have 8 days of prep and 8 days to shoot. You have to be a skilled craftsman besides being creative, and so they're in great demand. So they're scheduled way advanced. So we're right now. We are in the not early, but we're in the writing stages only of season 5. So the schedule we have is that we start the writing room in March, first week of March. We start filming the first week of August. And so we have a build-up where we're writing scripts and so forth, but we've already scheduled every one of our directors for the 10 episodes that will start being filmed in August. And, we got Ernest for his usual 2. That's all we could get him for, because he as an artist himself likes to move around, do different things, see what inspires him and so forth. So he pretty much limits that he'll work on our show for two episodes, and we have them secured, and I think his 2 are the last 2. So we're talking about November. We've already had to schedule him. We scheduled him probably in April for November. That's how hard it is to get really good directors.
I don't know if this is true of writers, of novelists, but I've heard from songwriters, which obviously is a different discipline. They say if you labor over a song, it usually doesn't come out as good. But if it just kind of funnels through you, if it feels like it's easy coming out, then it's usually a hit. With writing, is there any parallels between that and novel writing for you?
Well, there is for me, but I think that's antithetical to the way many people, especially critics, view writing, that it should be painful and ponderous and
torturous. Yeah.
And that's not the case for me. My most successful books, in terms of both sales and probably fan response and so forth, have been books I've written very quickly, and it's because I just kind of felt I had the story and it flowed out of me. And with my situation, a lot of it has to do with trust, and we can talk about this with the TV writing room as well. But I've had 2 editors in my 31 novels, two editors, and the only reason I switched was my first editor became the publisher and CEO and wasn't editing anymore. So I'm very confident in the editing process of my books. I know whatever I give them, we'll go to work on it together, and it will come out better. And that's happened 31 for 31 times. So when you have that confidence, my feeling is, get this out of me, get it to my editor, and then we'll make this thing good. And so I guess like that songwriter, I try to keep moving. I try to keep a lot of momentum. And therefore, some years I have 2 books. And, of course, the critics slammed that, saying Mr. Connelly should, New York Times, Mr. Connelly should slow down. At the same time they're giving the book a good review. It's just a little ironic. But in terms of the TV room, writing room, we have a showrunner. That's the creative boss of a show, and that's a writer, head writer. I guess they used to call them just head writer. But we have a showrunner and 6 writers, and I have confidence in all of them. I'm involved in this. I see the raw scripts, and I see as they get edited and rewritten and get better and so forth. To me, it's the same thing. Get your script to the room, because these are all really smart minds who have the best intentions for the show in mind. And, there's not sniping, there's no competition or anything like that. It's like, how do we make this better? And this is what I suggest, or whatever. And so I do feel that a script written fast, as long as it's going to a group that you can have confidence in, that's a good thing. And that's pretty much what happens in Bosch. I mean, different writers take different amounts of times, but some are fast and some are not, or some are not so fast, I should say. But in TV, you got to, we're going to start filming in August, and we need scripts. So you can't be ponderous and torturous and all those things.
And that time crunch sometimes can, I would imagine, bring out some surprising things that maybe all the time in the world wouldn't have if you had that luxury.
Yeah, I mean, I came out of the newspaper business where, talk about time crunch, there's hard and fast deadlines, and I was on the police beat, and I left the news business in '94, so it was still fat and happy back then, and papers came out several times a day. I can still remember I worked in my hometown of Fort Lauderdale. They had a morning and afternoon paper, and several different editions, and I was a crime reporter, and so I would have to write the same story different ways multiple times a day. If I had new information, then you put that in, but sometimes you had nothing new, and you had to act like you did. And so this kind of quick writing, harsh deadlines has served me well once I moved into a world where it's not necessary. If you want to take 4 years to write a novel, you can. I just want to write mine in about 8 months.
Exactly.
So it's worked out.
I mean, that's another thing I love about your work, especially the Bosch series, because through that character you can track the evolution of L.A. because you're writing about a character through many years. I mean, that has to be one of the joys of that, just like what Altman did with Marlowe in Long Goodbye.
Well, it's definitely a joy, and it's definitely a gift I've been given. It's not something I could have seen happen. I wrote a book about Harry Bosch, and I loved going back to motoring through Raymond Chandler's work in a week or two. I love series crime fiction, so when I turned that first book in, I was hoping they'd want another, and they did, and then they wanted another. And the first one came out 25 years ago, so he's had a longevity on the page that could never have been in my plans and is off the charts. But once it became clear I could write about this guy for a long time, possibly as long as I'm a writer, I did embrace that aspect that, this is anthropology. I can actually use this guy to show an evolution of a city. And that's what I try to do. I mean, obviously I got to keep in mind that this is an entertainment and I can't, be didactic or anything like that, but you kind of pick your moments to, work into a story something that's different now or that's changed or a question about something in society and, whether we want to go in that direction. And so it makes it fun. It makes me realize, I don't have to do all this in one book. If I want to write for the next 5 years, then I have 5 books to get my point across if I want.
Yeah, I would think that it has as much to do with withholding as feeling. Like you don't want to give everything you got your arsenal in one book.
Well, it's like that is the ultimate question, and it's different for me now than it was, when I wrote the first Bosch book. I felt, I got to get in the door. I got to get this published. I got to get it noticed. So I can't leave anything out. I got to put everything into it except for the kitchen sink. But I did have that he was orphaned, that his mother was murdered, and so that was the only string I could pull if they said we want another book. And so my intention was, when that happened, when they actually did say we want another book, I thought the second book would be him going back in time to investigate his mother's murder. But one of those good editors I've had over the career said, "Hey, you can hold that back. That's the governing psychology of this character. Why do it in the second book? Let's talk about the long view." And that was one of the lucky moments I had, that I actually had an editor who was thinking about the long view when I had only written one book.